Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's wonderful that so many of you are interested to hear me rattling on about temperate rainforests. Maybe it's not quite so surprising because there's a lot. The habitat has been in the media quite a lot recently in the last few years, and the temperate rainforest getting a bit better known. So, and I'm a botanist. I work with my wife Alison, doing surveys and stuff all over, mainly over Scotland. And just so happens I've done quite a bit of work looking at temperate rainforest habitats, mainly in the West Highlands, and then other kinds of surveys in other parts of Scotland. So, and quite a lot of that work looking quite specifically at mosses and liverworts, which are important things in the temperate rainforest. So I've got it's like a kind of illustrated tour really through the habitats with pictures of habitat in general and some close-ups of some of the species I can talk about and some maps and things as well. And some drawings. I do artwork, so that's a picture of some temperate rainforest in Morvern in the West Highlands in coloured pencil. And that one there is somewhere in West Lothian, a lot further east. Because what I've been finding is obviously there's obvious interest in the western temperate rainforest. They're wonderful places, very, very rich botanically in all sorts of ways, especially with the mosses, liverworts, and the lichens. And it's interesting that there are some of these western species occurring now further east in places like the Central Belt. So first in this series of pictures and so on, I'm talking mainly about the Western stuff, and then the latter part looking at what I've been finding further east. So I hope it's of interest. Temperate rainforest in the West Highlands. It's wonderful habitat. And one of the first things you notice about it when you go in there is it's very, very mossy. And actually what we see and think that's moss, actually a lot of them are liverworts as well, which look a bit like mosses and differ in various ways. Some of the close-up photos will help to show some of the liverwort features. So very kind of green, mossy looking places, but there are lots of lichens and ferns and other vascular plants as well in there. But their mossiness is a very characteristic thing about their appearance, and they're very rich in different kinds of species, lots and lots of species of mosses, liverworts, and lichens. So that's a photo of some temperate rainforest in the West Highlands on kind of acid soils with acid rocks. A lot of them are quite acid, really. Not all of them, though. And thinking of their distribution, Britain and Ireland are really important parts of Europe for this kind of habitat. And the climate seems to be the main reason behind this. It's a climate that has got mild winters, relatively cool summers, and it's very wet, high volume of rain and high frequency of rain. And the green areas on this map show those parts of Europe where it's rainy, like more than 140 centimeters a year, and where the winters aren't too cold. Coldest month, no more than about a couple of degrees, and no less than a couple of degrees, and the summers are below 16 degrees Celsius. And the blue and the purple are similar, but with winters a bit colder, and the red and the grey are areas where the summers get warmer, and with the grey, some of the winters get colder as well. So not quite such a perfect balance. The green areas are really the best. So Britain and Ireland, very important. West coast of Norway is pretty good as well. This is on the left is the same map, the same sort of colour meanings shown just for Britain and Ireland, a bit more detailed. So it's quite a lot of Western Britain and the west of Ireland with this kind of what you could call a sort of rainforest climate, according to the definition by a guy called Paul Alabak, American guy. There have been various definitions, really, but his seems to be a reasonably good one. But it's not as if all those green rainforest areas are all the same climatically, and it's not as if their temperate rainforest is all the same. The map on the right is an index of what you could call oceanicity or rainforestness. It's a combination of how much rain there is and how little the temperature through the year varies from a medium temperature. In this case, I've taken 9 degrees. So small temperature range and high rainfall will boost the index value, and you get a higher index value in the West Highlands and parts of the west of Ireland compared with most other parts of Western Britain. No surprise, really, that those areas have particularly rich rainforest, loads and loads of interesting species in there that really do need these very humid and equable conditions. Some people have asked, would the National Vegetation Classification be a good way of defining temperate rainforest? It doesn't kind of work really. These are different, and I don't know how many of you know the National Vegetation Classification. It's a very, very good system of classifying vegetation based on the mixes of plant species. Various NVC communities, the communities going right from rainforest areas to much more eastern areas where it's not rainforest, so they don't really work to indicate rainforest. At the sub-community level, some of them do to some degree. W18E, for example, is not bad, although it's a pretty uncommon kind of western pinewood. And W17A is mostly in the rainforest zone. W11B kind of mostly, but you can't really say that equals rainforest always guaranteed. And there are so many other MVCs that are not always rainforest, so we can't really use the MVC for that purpose. Sometimes people say, oh, if it's just got loads and loads of mosses growing on the rocks and growing up on the trees, or maybe if it's got epiphytic polypody fern. There's a thing got into the media somehow in the last few years that polypody ferns growing on trees equals rainforest. It isn't as simple as that. Epiphytic polypody is something we see a bit more common in the west, but further east, like this site in Midlothian, not rainforest. But if you've got a fairly sheltered place in the east, you sometimes can as well. Likewise, just the sheer abundance of moss. Those two pictures there, the photo and the drawing of places in East Lothian. It's not a rainforest area, but there's loads of moss all over the trees. But the important thing would be really what are the species there that would tell us more about how much of a rainforest element we're really looking at. And in the case of those two, it's very common widespread mosses. And the actual species that we look at that are most telling in terms of rainforest indicators are species that grow mainly on rocks and trees. Some people might think that because these places are so mossy, just masses of big mounds of big growths of moss on the ground and everywhere, that those must be like the rainforest mosses and the things that tell us it's rainforest. Actually, most of these big, bulky mosses on the ground looking so prominent are mostly nationally more widespread species that in themselves aren't rainforest indicators. And so when we go in there to look for the real rainforest species, we're often walking past some of those things on the ground where I put that across, onto some, looking at trees and on rocks, even some rocks that may look quite bare, looking at tiny little fiddly things. And somebody might think, why are they looking at that when there's all this big lush stuff? But some of these particular good indicators are very small plants. Some of them are bigger, the big range of sizes in these things. Here are some examples. These are all liverworts. They're western liverworts, which are most common in the rainforest zone. Some of them break out east of the rainforest zone here and there, but these are species that are very characteristic, very found in some places really in good quantity in rainforests. And you can see variation in the shapes of the leaves. Liverworts are interesting plants. They have much greater range of shapes of leaves, all cut up into lobes and different things. Moss leaf shapes are kind of much more conservative, really, some kind of variation on oval, more or less. So there's a little selection of oceanic liverworts that we see in the west, and some pictures to show the kind of rocky habitat that can be so good for these, like especially where there's a stream coming through. These ones are in Morven in the West Highlands. Morven's a brilliant area. A lot of my pictures are of Morven. Some people have maybe never heard of Morven. It's a sparsely populated area in the Midwest Highlands, a brilliant place. So rocks along streams cut into little sort of gullies and things, or deeper ravines, really humid environment. They can be brilliant places for these oceanic bryophytes that like this humid, equable environment to be in. These are some of the smaller ones. I said that some of them are really quite little. What I've done here is I've cropped these photos into the shapes of pencils to give an idea of scale. I worked it out as well as I could so that the plants are at the right scale in relation to an average pencil. So as you can see, they are tiny wee things, really, really small. If they were creeping over a pencil, you'd have to get your lens out to look close and see them. They would be marking that pencil with markings that are, if anything, finer and more detailed than the actual writing that you see. When I do these drawings with colored pencils, some of them, they've got numbers, code numbers, and names of colors. Sometimes I have to look really close to see these things. Well, these things are even finer than that. So, and they're special Western plants. Here's another one. This is a wee bit bigger. Radula aquilegia. It's a lovely liverwort that grows on moist rocks. All the shoots all facing in one direction largely. And this nice kind of browny green color. Though it's not very common. And the stuff just above it there is actually a species of fern. I've got some more photos of these later. Filmy ferns, which are kind of like a bit like kind of big mosses or big liverworts, and they're also Western, mainly rainforest species. Here are 3 more species of radula. The genus radula is a wonderful genus, beautiful plants, liverworts, and these 3 are very rare Western rainforest species. And the first one on the left, radula voluta, it's beautiful pale green color, and it grows. They all grow in pretty wet places. And radula voluta, I've written, sometimes I write little poems about these things, about its preferred kind of hydrology, the places where it'll grow by some kind of water. So it's like a rushing gush, way too much. A little trickle, not enough. Something in between the two, like flow and splash, yes, that'll do, because that's the kind of place it likes to be in. Because if it was too much of a big rushing gush all the time, it would probably scrape these things off the rocks, because it's a medium-sized liverwort, that one. Very, very small ones can maybe hold themselves there when there's a lot of water, but something like this probably wouldn't. And so it's very, very fussy. I did once find some of this by hearing the sound of a stream. It was on the island of Mull. I was walking along this road, and there's some woodland just above me on a south-facing slope, and I could hear this sort of tinkling of a stream coming through the woods. And I thought to myself, south-facing wood, that kind of sound, that sounds like the kind of place for radula voluta. And I went in there, and very soon there was radula voluta, and which is always great to see because it's really pretty rare. And actually growing with it was radula carringtonii, the middle one, which is really, really rare. So it was a very, very special place. And I'm glad I heard that noise. The one on the right, radula holtii, that's a real rare thing. Until about 12 or so years ago, it was known in Ireland and only rare there as well. And also actually Southwest Europe, Macaronesia, and I think somewhere in Iberia as well. But a guy called Nick Hodgetts found it in Ardnamurchan in 2012, I think it was. And then 2013, I was up in Wester Ross, and to my great surprise, I found some there, because I didn't think it would be that far north, which prompted me to write a wee verse about that one as well. Radula holtii. So this species took me by surprise. I thought it would have been too cold in Wester Ross, where the eagle flies through snowy mountains, but behold, on a rock face by a splashing stream, birch and rowan nearby, hidden in the bottom of a deep ravine, something green to catch the eye. So, I I took a bit of a liberty there because I know Wester Ross isn't the place for the snowiest mountains, but you kind of think, what other word could I put in? Maybe there's a bit of an allowance for that. Okay, so yeah, wonderful little things, these radulas. Next one, Acrobulbus wilsonii. This is back in Morven again. It's another rare one. The same kinds of places, very wet, so humid atmosphere kind of places. That's actually the site, the stream in Morven. These are coloured pencil drawings I've done, and the Acrobulbus grew about. I can't jump up to the exact spot, but it's somewhere in the middle, up in there. It grows, patch of it about that big more or less, and that's a bit of a close-up of it. Beautiful green liverwort. See, these plants are quite small, really, and steep rock faces are so good for them because they can get a reasonable foothold, but bigger common mosses can do so only to a limited degree before they're going to fall off because it's so steep. Gravity is the problem there. So, and also water coming by enough times hitting those rocks helps to stop the really big mosses from taking over. So all these rocks that some people might look at and think, oh, they're just quite bare looking with little bits of smudgy green stuff, those can be some of the most wonderful places in which to find these uncommon oceanic rainforest species. Great sort of habitats. Metzgeria leptonura, another one. This is quite big, actually. This is a liverwort that we call a thalloid or thallose liverwort. It doesn't have doesn't have stems and separate leaves. It's got what we call a thallus, which just goes along and wobbles about and branches here and there, but it's all the same sort of looking stuff. There's a bit more detail than that, but for the current purposes, that's what it looks like. All these little sort of strap-like things, beautiful pale yellowy green colour. It's a lovely plant of kind of moist banks that are more or less neutral or slightly base enriched, especially on sides of ravines, and it's quite uncommon. So another special rainforest one. Dicranum scotianum, some mosses now. This is a western species. It does actually grow a bit further east than the rainforest, in the rainforest zone, like it grows on the granites of the Cheviots, among other places. But it's most common in the rainforest zone on acid rocks and on very steep acid rocks. And I wrote a thing about that one as well, which was, because you see by the shape of it, Dicranum scotianum, it grows in cushions round as the sun. To pull them off the rocks is fun. Well, what a cruel thing to do. Total numpty through and through. Okay, I know that isn't right. This guy, he might be fairly bright in some respects, however small, but don't expect that he and all will recognise this special moss and knowingly prevent its loss. Information's what they need, a book for them to take and read. Or if they just aren't up for that, there's illustrated rhyming chat. I don't mean to imply that you folks are the ones that aren't up for reading stuff in books, hence me giving you the illustrated rhyming chat. I know that you're above that. And I don't want to imply that you're the people who will go having fun pulling this stuff off the rocks. Yeah, it's a nice thing. It's just really tight cushions. Another one, kind of related to it in some way, Dicranodontium subporodictyon. I put a picture of this one in as an example of one of these rainforest habitat species that has a very disjunct distribution, meaning that it's in one part of the world and then there's a big gap and then it's in another part or another part in another direction. In this case, it's in Scotland, it's in the west of Canada, and it's in the Himalaya region. Maybe once it grew more in between those places, like maybe some thousands of years ago at the time of what they call the climatic optimum, maybe there's more continuous favourable climate across a larger part of the northern hemisphere, perhaps. And if that's the case, then it would have been broken up since as the climate changed. Anyway, it grows in these parts of the world where they have more or less a broadly similar climate, kind of cool, but not too cold and very, very wet. So we're lucky to have some good sites for Dicranodontium subporodictyon in the West Highlands and a site for it on Skye as well, all up in northwest. It's a great plant. It grows by on acid rocks by streams and waterfalls. It likes to have a bit of water coming through it quite a lot of the time, and it's pretty rare. Yeah, those filmy ferns I was talking about. This is Wilson's filmy fern. It's somebody described, I think it might have been Derek Ratcliffe, described it as an honorary oceanic bryophyte because it grows with the bryophytes being mosses and liverworts, in so many places. It's just mixed in there with all these things. And it's not much bigger than these bryophytes as well. You get whole patches of the Wilson's filmy fern then mingling up with patches of different liverworts, all a kind of community in themselves, really. And it's got the same kind of distribution nationally and through Europe. Definitely sort of a wet, equable rainforest climate. So you can't ignore the filmy ferns when you're doing surveys of mosses and liverworts in these places. And there's the Tunbridge filmy fern as well, which has a basic kind of fairly similar distribution. Doesn't go quite so far north, and it's a bit more common. Southwest England, it's more common than the Wilson's filmy fern, and it also goes in southeast England as well, in some sort of steep-sided, sheltered valleys in the sandstone there. So it's not quite as strongly oceanic, or not quite such a rainforest indicator as the other one, but they're both basically mainly rainforest zone plants. And hay-scented buckler fern is another fern that does very well in the rainforest zone. It's quite, from a distance, you might see quite an ordinary looking fern. A lot of these tufty ferns looking like that. It's got kind of crinkly looking leaves, though, that gives it away quite often. Lovely plant. These are all plants of acid rocks and soils, these three ferns I've just shown you. Another thing we find of interest when we're looking at the bryophytes in these forests is that some of them, their distributions are very much associated with ancient woodland. When we compare the sites where they grow with historic information, well, the ancient woodland inventory. And in my surveys, I did that, and I found that some species came out particularly strongly associated with ancient woodland, statistically so. It showed very well, especially this one, Plagiochila heterophylla. This beautiful big liverwort. It forms big patches on acid rocks and sometimes on trees as well. It likes to grow in woodland on south-facing or southeast-facing slopes. Maybe that's partly why it's more of an ancient forest indicator, because if people start mucking about with the tree canopy on a southerly aspect, the light can whack in there big time and do more damage as far as drying is concerned than it would if it was on a north-facing slope. So it's a good ancient woodland indicator. It looks very different when it's dry compared with when it's wet. The leaves kind of roll up, so it's quite easily recognizable. Another one just about as strongly associated with ancient woodland in these same places is Pseudomarsupidium decipiens, which I wrote a short thing because it used to have a different name. So it used to be called Adelanthus decipiens. We called it Adelanthus. What a lovely name. With Pseudomarsupidium, life just ain't the same. Because you know how people do taxonomic stuff, all for good purposes. Obviously, it's really, really good stuff, advancements and everything. But, and we all find when we've got a new name, we think, oh God, what the heck does that mean? And some of these names are longer. And indeed, I think Adelanthus was a lovely name, Adelanthus decipiens. It's just a beautiful name, really. I always think Adelanthus decipiens, it makes me think, I don't know why, there's somebody coming in to play the piano. And somebody introducing somebody saying, we now have Adelanthus decipiens is going to come and play us a little sonata on the piano. And everybody's, oh, very nice. You know. So but you can't do that with Pseudomarsupidium, could you? Pseudomarsupidium might be some bad guy. You know, heck, that was Pseudomarsupidium I just saw. Get him, quick, phone the cops or something. You know. Here's another ancient woodland species. This is Hageniella micans. Hageniella, see, we used to call that one Sematophyllum micans, and now they've changed it to Hageniella. Hag doesn't sound so nice, does it? Anyway, we get used to these names. Hageniella, it's not as bad as just hag. Anyway, it's a beautiful moss. It forms these, they're literally like a gold plating on the rocks, very closely attached there on the rock, shoots all pointing in one direction, kind of moist rock where water will seep down sometimes. It's an incredible, interesting little thing. It's pretty rare. It's mainly in the ancient woodlands, which haven't been disturbed too much. But on a smaller scale, it seems to need actually some element of disturbance to prevent it from being overcome by things like bigger mosses, or maybe leaf litter all building up all around it. Not surprising, because it's pretty small. And those factors that help it in that regard will be the movement of water along by streams, because I often find it on rocks by streams, and also the action of things like the feet of deer, or maybe some places cattle or even sheep, but certainly deer, walking through the woodland, just helping to keep things open a little bit. And in some places I've been, including the place where I took that photo, We found some populations of it kind of aligned along a wee deer track running through the woods. Fortunately, there was also some of it by a stream as well, because you see it by the deer track. You think, what happens if they reduce the deer density so much that all the ground vegetation comes up, but the stream will still be there. But yeah, interesting thing, a mix of element of disturbance and an element of not disturbance because it needs that tree canopy. Um, in the cooler end of temperate rainforest, which is not specifically just northern, but also higher altitude, getting up into the hills more, we have some of these species, like it's like the equivalent of the temperate rainforest, but up in the open in this sort of heaths. There's a little assemblage called the Northern Atlantic hepatic mat that was described by Derek Ratcliffe. And these things also, we find them lower down in the woods, especially on north-facing slopes at the upper edges of some of the woods. Beautiful plants, all different colors, different shaped leaves, sort of purples and orange and gold and yellow. My wife Alison did her PhD on this group of plants. She knows them very well. Her PhD on them, looking at them in heaths up in the mountains. Great places they are, and they can form big patches. That big orangey red stuff growing up there, that's this Herbertus hutchinsea, beautiful plant. So there's a whole load of bryophytes. Let's look at some lichens. I'm not really a lichenologist. I do look at lichens quite a lot, but I wouldn't describe myself as sort of professional level lichenologist. Anyhow, I've got some pictures of some lichens of these western places, grouped according to some of the communities in which they are recognized to form. This one here, there's a community, for a long time it's been called the Lobarion community because there's some species called Lobaria that are very prominent in it. I also think the word Lobarion, it sounds like something kind of old, like something like the name of a theatre or something, or perhaps the name of a pub. That's why I put it in that kind of writing. The particular species, these 4 lichens, they all used to be put into the genus Lobaria. Only one of them is retained in that genus. The other 3 have been put into separate genera in recent years. But they're all big lichens, different colors. They're wonderful looking things, and they're all really rare outside the West Highlands and parts of the west of Ireland as well. But mainly the West Highlands is the best place for them. Actually, they are not so much really strongly rainforest species in terms of their climate requirements. They had been growing further east in the past, but since the time of the Industrial Revolution, pollution, because they're very pollution sensitive, pollution had caused them to lose out in those places and left them mainly in the rainforest zone. So they feature very prominently in the rainforest, these big lichens. And in some places in the West Highlands, one can be lucky enough to find a tree on which all 4 are growing so close together, you can put your hand on there and touch all 4 at once. It's a wee game to do for us surveyors. Got to do something to occupy your time or sense of humour or something. And I found a few places where I've been able to do this. We were doing some work on Mull, and there was this tree, and I could only find 3 of them. Well, actually, that's really good by national standards. And I couldn't find all 4. And rather than think of it as, well, we didn't quite get all 4, we just had to make do with 3, to think of it positively, think, hey, the police can come out of that police station and they can look at these lichens, 3 of them, and they can go, hello, 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 as police do or did. That's why I wrote it in police coloured writing. I looked at that tree. I was quite a while looking around there, and I was wondering, is anybody in that place looking through the window going to think, what's that guy doing there? But nobody came and said anything. Sticta species, these are a bit like lobarias as well, but they're brown. They smell of fish. If you get that smell on your fingers, it's quite tricky to get off. You have to really wash the stuff off. But they're another group. Commonest in the rainforest zone, and even better than those in a way, like rarer pseudo-cyphallarias. These are like brown stictors, but they've got dots and squiggles around the edges of different colors. Some of them are kind of silvery gray, and one of them, Crinita, has got them a kind of yellowy color. So they're really kind of decorated looking lichens. Always a very special find to find any kind of pseudo-cyphallaria. We find them on rocks and trees, same as the lobarias. They're and the stictors, rocks and trees, not on the ground. Um, and there's quite a lot of these lobaryon lichens, big lichens, all different colours. Pectinias, especially Pectinia cyanoloma, got a real strong rainforest distribution. Panaria rubiginosa is mainly in these western places. Always a kind of interesting mix of the brown and the silver, which is why I wrote its name with alternating colours. And some of them, they call them jelly lichens because when they're wet, they kind of get swollen up a bit and they look quite different actually compared to when they're dried. They can just go all really crinkly looking. And so I've got some photos of these things. There are quite a lot of these jelly lichens, some of them pretty tricky to tell apart. And some of these jelly lichens are, and also the pseudocyphallarias we just saw, are more genuinely rainforest species in terms of their climatic requirements. It's not that they're showing a fake rainforest distribution because they were polluted out by sulfur dioxide further east where they would otherwise be happy to grow. They do seem to need that rainforest climates more than the lobarias. And then there's a group called the parmelion. These are on more acid bark, because the lobaryon is mostly on neutral to base-rich bark, trees like ash, hazel, elm, rowan, whereas the parmelion community is more on oak and birch and alder. So Hypotrichina livigata is one of the very characteristic lichens, and you often find mosses and liverworts in it, including there's a nice clump of Scapania gracilis, one of our commoner oceanic liverworts that likes acid rocks and bark. This is on an oak tree in Morven. Hypotrichina taylorensis is another one. It's got nice little lobules in the middle. It's quite different looking. And Hypotrichina sinuosa is quite a small one. It grows more on twigs rather than the actual kind of main trunk. And Menegatias, these are similar looking things, little black dots, little holes in the thallus, all on mainly acid bark, and Cetrilia olivatorum. So they're all much of a muchness in terms of their colour. Some people might think, well, that's a bit boring compared with the nice lobarias and all those lobaryon species. But these parmelion species, the Hypotrichinas and the Cetrilia, a bit more consistently, really genuinely rainforest species needing that climate. And then third community, Graphidion. These are things that you get on smooth bark, like young bark, but especially hazel. The younger stems of hazel is brilliant for this Graphidion community. All these dots and squiggles, and where it's in the rainforest zone and on hazels that haven't been coppiced too much, so it's kind of like ancient woodland, undisturbed hazel woodland. The younger stems, smoother stems of those can be very, very rich in some of these more western, not very common, little crustose lichens that form this western kind of Graphidion community, like Pyrenea occidentalis with bits of orange and little black dots. Crutandina petractoides, another one, really, really good western rainforest species, both of those two. Pyrenea livigata is another one that's got the perithecia, the main black dots, the fruiting bodies, but it's also got little things called pycnidia. Well, the other ones have pycnidia too, but some of them. But in this one, they're all lined up in the spaces between individual thalli, and the dots are so small. I thought, if you wanted to draw those, I'd be getting my 0.05 pen, which I try not to use very much because I don't want to wear it down because it's so fine. But even with that, I don't think I'll be able to do it. These things are really small. So nice to see these little fine dots, just like someone's been with an amazingly small pen and done these little dots in rows very, very carefully. Fissurina alboscripta is another one that's you can hardly even see it. It's almost all white, very rare. It grows on hazels in the West Highlands. It's known only from Scotland. I wrote a poem about that one as well, which is Fissurina alboscripta. Not so much a pretty picture, more a kind of abstract style that even after quite a while, no, we still can't figure out what the heck it's all about. Despite the white, we're in the dark. What's the meaning of this mark? Maybe it'll come to us while pouring tea or on the bus. Maybe not, maybe never. Abstract artist, too damn clever. But here's a possibility. We've overlooked simplicity. Yes, of course, the artist's take on whiteness just for whiteness sake. Thanks. Have you ever had that? That sometimes there's some piece of modern art you think, what is this all about? Even for me, I went to art college. That's my background is art and music, and um, but still, you see something, you think, I can't figure this. Some kind of weird installation or something, and then you hear somebody talking about it, and you think, is that it? You know, you think it must be something incredibly profound and really deep philosophically. Apart from, I tell you, one guy, Martin Creed, he's really good. I've heard him talking about his stuff, and he's completely the opposite. He just says, "Oh, it don't really mean anything. I'm not really an artist." Or something. He's very humorous. He's got a great take on the work he does. He's very fun to hear. Um, yeah, hazels, some of them can be very rich and some of them very poor or poorer in these Graphidion and Loberion lichens, and you can't always tell until you get there looking closer. But what it seems to suggest is something to do with the history. So even some very well-grown hazel like that on the left there looks very nice, but I think it's probably been coppiced more in the past, and that's left its mark more than, say, that one on the right there, further into the wood, which looks a bit more straggly, but it's actually got really nice stuff on it. You've probably heard about this thing they call hazel gloves, Hypocreopsis rhododendri. It's a fungus that looks a bit like a lichen, these orange splodges, especially on hazels. And in these western rainforest places, it's actually been found quite a bit east as well from the rainforest climate zone. So it's not such a strong indicator as was first thought. And it's also turned up on, like in the southwest of England, in coastal places that are western, but they're drier than the kind of typical rainforest climate. So oceanic generally, but not specifically an indicator of the really, really wet climate. Not as much as was first thought anyway, with the increasing records that people are finding. And even in some of these western places, it's really quite windy. And one might think, how can things that might need high humidity cope with a windswept environment? But even in low-grown willows, they can form, well, these are common mosses here, forming thick mats going up the bases. The difference between this real shelter and the windy stuff just above there is quite remarkable. And of course, the same in the woodland, in the bigger trees, big growths of moss up which we're getting vaccinium blaeberry rhizomes growing up, growing more as a kind of climber in a way, and heath bedstraw doing something fairly similar, growing up through that deep mat of moss. And some of them, in some places where it's very humid and sheltered, some things can grow on the living leaves of other plants before those leaves have died. So they've got to colonize it pretty quick. Little tiny liverworts growing on evergreen leaves of ferns. So it's epiphyllous, which is something you find more in the tropics or subtropical places. So it's nice to have that here in Scotland. We do get threats to these things. Rhododendron, major threat, is devastating stuff, really bad news. Overgrazing, then the woods fizzle out. So obviously that's a problem. Nutrient enrichment from some kinds of pollution, really, encouraging the growth of algae that can dominate and outcompete smaller oceanic bryophytes and lichens. Hydro schemes, taking water out from streams, could make it less humid. Also, it could reduce the amount by which the stream is able to have splash and sort of a bit of scouring sometimes on the rocks. So it could potentially make it better for some of the common big mosses to dominate a bit too much. So don't really want to be having water taken out from the streams that have got really, really rich floras in them. And undergrazing, if you take out all grazing altogether, which isn't really natural, you can end up with dense masses of some species that can cause an overshading effect, like holly and ivy, although ivy not quite so much usually on the richer soils for ivy. And climate change, can't ignore climate change. If it's getting warmer, it could get a bit too warm, maybe in the summer, especially in parts of the south, and we might see a shrinking of the rainforest zone. Although milder winters could actually help some things in the north. And if the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, if that packs in, if that happens, then that'll change things a lot because it'll go much colder in Europe. So those are things that we can't really ignore. Not much we can, as individuals, we can really do about it. But um, so talking about about climate there and about pollution, leading on to these things further east, it's interesting to see some species colonizing, Western species moving further or peering further east in places like the Central Belt, and down south, even further east, some of them. The climate is not a rainforest climate in the Central Belt. It's drier than that. But the fact that these things might be helped by the fact that it has got a bit warmer in the last number of decades, and the winters have got wetter, and sulfur dioxide emissions have gone down massively since the Clean Air Act of 1956. And this seems to, that alone seems to have helped a lot of things. Hence, pollution sensitive mosses and liverworts, like these are some examples that are reckoned to be sensitive to sulfur dioxide pollution. Some of these are getting really common now. It's great to see in places like the Central Belt, especially, interestingly enough, especially on younger trees, often in plantations. I think this is because the older trees, if they were there back during the times when the sulfur dioxide pollution was bad and that stuff was getting onto their bark, the bark getting impregnated more with that, may be difficult for them to get rid of it, and maybe always being a bit of a problem. Whereas the young trees have come up, say since about the 1990s, they've never had it so bad, really. They've always been cleaner on the bark. So I think that's kind of helped these species to get in. A lot of the interesting finds I've had in the Central Belt have been on young trees. So yeah, species like these mosses and that liverwort, Metzgeria violacea, is really common in many places in the Central Belt. Eulota calvescens, this used to be really western. That red line was its eastern limits back in about the 1980s, and now it's gone much further east, which I wrote about here. I think it's probably the last of these poems. About Eulota calvescens, a special kind of western moss growing on a tree. The capsules are on longer stalks than other ones we see. From western shores it's marching east through territories new. We could just sit so patiently awaiting its debut. Not me. I headed westwards on a speculative hunt. In West Lothian I met it at its current eastern front. And as you'll see from that green line, though, it also, since I wrote that poem a few years ago, I found it just last year in East Lothian in a couple of places, and which is quite a big jump east. And interestingly, one of them, that one on the right, is growing on oak, and some of the stuff I saw in West Lothian was also on oak. In the West Highlands, we find the species mostly on hazel and ash, sometimes around bark that's not very acid. And oak bark is usually more acid. So it's interesting to find that maybe because the bark, if the bark's kind of relatively clean, maybe the oak bark is showing us something that it would have liked to have shown more but couldn't, because either there was lots of sulfur dioxide getting in there, or if you're way out in the west, there's more of a leaching effect anyway because there's so much rain. So maybe there's more potential on the bark of things like oak and even birch in the east if the air's clean enough, that they can support interesting species we wouldn't otherwise have expected there. Another one is Frulania tenerifea, which I haven't found on oak, but I found it on things like goat's willow and sycamore. Funnily enough, that's got good bark for some of these species. In West Lothian there, this was such a totally western species, or almost totally. So to find that in the Central Belt was really quite a surprise in West Lothian. I found it in Fife last year, I think it was, on a tree, just an ordinary looking tree by a path. I was just walking along. I thought, I mean, I didn't see it from the path. I just thought, let's just have a look on there, and then I saw it. And these places in West Lothian, these old bings, industrial places, some of them are great. There's this place called Foul Shields Bing. The name sounds, if somebody said Foul Shields Bing, it's a horrible place. You might think with a name like that, I'm not surprised. But actually, it's an old bing that's developed a lot of woodland since it had been kind of left. and some bits are quite damp. A lot of it's quite humid. And there's liverworts there, Colura. That's a real western species that has expanded, has moved east a lot in this country in the last few decades. And Frulenia tenerifea was there, just out of the site to the north towards Whitburn. There's Eulota calvescens and the Microlagernia, which is not such a rainforest species in total, but it's very western, this far north. If somebody had said a few decades ago that they said, I went on a walk and in a space of couple of hours or so, I saw those species, I'd be thinking, well, they must have been in the West Highlands, and that would be pretty nice few species to find: Frulenia tenerifea and Eulota colura, and the Frulenia and the Eulota. And if they'd said then, how about West Lothian for doing that, going on a walk and seeing all of those? And you think, no, you just a crazy thought, I would have thought. But no, that is now as possible. The little colura grows in all sorts of funny places. It's including, funny enough, on conifers, in conifer plantations. Here it is on a little young Sitka spruce in a very wet bit of woodland in West Lothian. And this one, Myriocoliopsis minutissima, a bit of a mouthful, tiny little thing. It likes more base-rich bark, and it likes a fairly warm climate. I think the milder winters have probably helped this one to move east. It's not so much of a rainforest wetness species, can grow in places a bit drier, but that's coming east. And somebody's found it in or around Edinburgh, in the Edinburgh area rather than actually West Lothian County in the last year or two. So, and I found it in 2 places in West Lothian. So that's another one coming east at this latitude. That little Microlagernia, which at this latitude as well, it's really western. I found that in East Lothian on the birch. And that's incredible. Think, how did that get there? It's pretty common in the West, but it's a species that doesn't produce capsules or gemi, doesn't produce really obvious reproductive structures. So you might think it'd be very difficult for that one to get around. One wonders, how is it so common in the West anyway? And how did it get over there to East Lothian? And some lichens, the Hypotrichina sinuosa that I showed a picture of earlier growing on a twig, that's turning up in West Lothian, quite a few places on trees, oak and conifer. I found it growing. And even in the Lothians, we can find things growing as epiphyls, like that other picture I showed you, which are growing on hard fern. This one, I suppose it's a shame about the host species because it's a rhododendron. Although it's in the west that rhododendron is more of a worry. But this is in East Lothian, not very far from where I live, in a wee glen there, very sheltered and humid. And it was growing. The the Metzgeria violacea in itself is not an oceanic species, but just the fact that any bryophyte can grow as an epiphyll is something that's just kind of demanding good levels of humidity and a pretty decent temperature for it to seem to be able to keep growing and to colonize places quick enough before that leaf has died off. So it hasn't got that much time. And the other one there is growing on a Norway spruce leaf. And the little Colura is growing on a Sitka spruce leaf in West Lothian. And I also found it not far from there growing on a plastic tree tube. It can crop up on all sorts of interesting substrates. I found it in Argyll. I found it growing on an old milk carton that had been dumped in some forest. And I looked at it and I thought, and I looked at the carton, and you know how they have the date on there, like the use by date, but it was, I hadn't really noticed before. They give you the date and the month, but they don't give you the year, and you can see why, because you don't need to know the year. You're not going to keep it in your fridge for more than 12 months. So I looked at this and I thought, okay, but I want to know what year it was to get an idea of how long it took that liverwort to colonize. So I rang up that, I sent an email to that email address that was on there. It's probably a slightly strange bit of correspondence for them, but and I had a reply back telling me when it had been sent out from the factory, and so it was just a little over 2 years that it had been from then to the time when I found it. So this little colura had colonized it in that time. I also found that colura growing on some old polystyrene, like fish and chip carton places in Argyll. I was in the car and I was just about to drive off from this bit of forestry, and there were these cartons lying down there. And I thought, should I go and have a look for those for collier? And I was kind of half thinking, I was thinking, no, I wouldn't really. I thought, maybe, why don't I go and have a look? And there was loads of it growing on them, absolutely loads of it. So, and then I think that's about the end. I think I've timed it to be well enough within the hour, because leaving space for anybody who wants to ask any questions. That's another picture of rainforest habitat in Morven. And that's us. That's the end of that.